Okay, so we're up to Halacha Zion of Perek Ches. So we were talking about that we're not allowed to strengthen the hands of evildoers. So I had mentioned last week, I wasn't sure if it's part of Lifnei Iver. It seems that it's a rabbinic halacha that's based on Lifnei Iver, according to many opinions. So again, Lifnei Iver is not to place a stumbling block in front of the blind, which includes I can't let someone who's going to do an avera do an avera. Something which might be interesting to certain political groups. There's Rabbi Bleich wrote probably 45 years ago. Maybe I'm wrong on the time, but about there's a halacha that you can't sell traps or weapons near an air miklat. An air miklat is a city of refuge for someone who killed b'shogeg, because if the Goal Hadam, the relative of the victim, would be near there, they might buy a weapon or a trap to try to kill the accidental person who committed the manslaughter. So Rabbi Bleich actually had an article, not a long article, about selling weapons to non-Jews. That doesn't seem to be that there's seems to be many sources that it's not allowed. So I'm saying, the classic example in the Gemara, if you know someone's a Nazir, they made a vow not to come in contact with the dead and not to abstain from the wine. You can't hand a glass of wine to the Nazir. So you can't do something that's going to cause someone to do an Avera. That's Lifnei Iver. So here, they're going to do the Avera anyway. We can't make it easier for them. So we can't sell them this stuff. So Halacha Zayin, v'chein mashalas isha l'chaverta chashud al shvius nachal kvar rechaim v'tanar avalo tavar v'lo tichanima. A woman is allowed to lend to her friend who we don't think keeps laws of Shmita. She's allowed to lend her a sifter and a sieve and a grinder and an oven, even though she might be, doing too much or using it to bake bread with stuff that is not allowed to. I don't know. But you can't sift or grind at the same time as her. Usually the reason is because we're worried that some of the stuff is going to get mixed together. So Rav Kook says this is saying that in general you're allowed to lend her all these things because we could assume that she has no ill intent. Rav Kook mentions because of Darkei Shalom. I just want to mention a hapsak of Rav Kook. It's not exactly related to this, but 105 years ago, whenever it was, more than 100 years ago, you don't think of it, but there had to be Jewish stevedores. There had to be big, strong Jews who unloaded the ships in Haifa. It was a port city. Mr. Goodman, Al Vashalom, used to tell us how when they would go in the Navy, the Navy would be stuck paying a lot of money for usually low quality stuff. That the other countries that they would dock in would give them low quality stuff and charge them a lot. He said the stuff they got from Israel was the highest quality, the best stuff they ever got. But there was a restaurant that a lot of the stevedores worked at, and the problem was they had fleishiks during the 9 days. So the question is, should you close them down or pull the hechsher or what? So Rav Kook says we don't want them to eat treif, so they shouldn't be eating. It's not a diraisa, but it's better for them to be eating kosher fleishiks than to eat treif during these days. So keep it open. And later on, it didn't. He wasn't alive at the time. He was alive, but he wasn't there. But the Chazon Ish later had a psak. They said absolutely you have to close it down, and certainly I think they bring the name of the Chazon Ish because actually I think if I remember correctly they asked Reb Chaim Kanievsky to Harlev a similar question, and he said absolutely you have to close down the restaurant, this and that. But Rav Kook, they're Jews, they're eating kosher. It's good that they're eating kosher. So sometimes Darkei Shalom, you have to. I don't know if you need the fifth Shulchan Aruch to come up with that psak, but I think it's a good lesson how to treat your fellow Jew. Okay, you think both of them? You think both of them make a lot of sense? Okay. Yeah, but there are places that stay open fleishiks during the 9 days. I think I was in Israel. Well, see, the thing is, there's a little bit of a difference because in Israel, not in Israel, anywhere, Sephardim, Ashkenazim don't eat fleishiks the whole 9 days. Sephardim only don't eat if it's the week that Tisha B'Av falls on. So in the first few days of the 9 days, if it's before Shabbos, Sephardim can eat fleishiks. So depending on what kind of hechsher the place has, there's reasons why even nowadays in Israel, for part of the 9 days, you could imagine a fleishik restaurants being open or shawarma stands. I think I had that problem once. It ended up we were going to buy a falafel or whatever, but they also had shawarma there, so the stuff was fleishiks. So I didn't want to have that during the 9 days. Okay, so Rav Kook says, in general, you could assume good intentions, even if it's a bit of a stretch to assume it, because maybe the sifter or whatever, she was using it to count coins. For a sieve to, she had dirt or sand that she needed to sift, not wheat, or she needed to grind up spices. Or an oven to dry out flax bundles, or whatever the word is called. And according to this opinion, that flax does not have Shmita prohibitions. But if she's telling us that because she's gonna use it, I just got this, this new shipment of, of wheat, so I want to make it into flour, then you know that it was Shmita produce. Then you're not allowed to lend her any of these things. And it appears from the Tosfos and Gittin that the fact that we assume that there's no problem with what we're lending her is only because of Darchei Shalom. Since it's only because of Darchei Shalom, so that there will be peace between people, this is only a question if she asks. Because if she asks and you refuse, then she's going to be upset at you. But to sell them, there's no things of Darchei Shalom. They say, do you have a spare something that I could sell that you could sell me? And you could say no, and they're not going to be upset. So you can't assume that she's asking for a grinder because she needs to grind her spices. If she says, I have, these cinnamon sticks that I want to grind up, assuming that cinnamon sticks don't have it, whatever, well, because you people, I mean, she says, I just got imported from China back in the day when spices and stuff came from the Far East, from India, China. She says, I just got the shipment, and then it's not Perish Bias, then you'd be allowed to lend her because you're not assuming. You have reason to assume that there's actually no problem. That would be a better situation than just a stam. It seems, according to that opinion, also to lend, there's no problem of Darchei Shalom. Meaning they say, can I rent this from you? So if you say no, it's not going to cause animosity because sometimes it's for hire. Maybe you think in a couple of days you're going to rent it out to someone else, so you can't rent it out now. So it's not a problem. So unless you know for sure that it's okay, you wouldn't be able to rent. You couldn't rent it or sell it to them. But again, this is talking about lending, so there'd be more animosity if you would refuse to lend. So unless you know specifically that it's not okay, you are allowed to lend it, but that doesn't apply to selling or renting. According to the Rashba and getting there's no difference between selling and renting. To borrowing and renting. So according to the Rashba, though, there is a difference between selling and there is no difference between selling and borrowing. So if you're allowed to rely on it because of Darchei Shalom to lend, you could also rely on the Darchei Shalom to sell. Okay, halacha ches. Machazikin de nachon b'shviyas b'dvarim balvad. You can strengthen the hand of non-Jews on Shmita only with words. To go and shira'u choresh ozoreah, armelo tischazek o tatzliach. So you see him if he's plowing or planting, you could say, what we would say, Yashakoach, right? And say Titchazek, be strong. Or you could say you should have good success with your crop. You're allowed to tell them and give them what we call a moral support, right, Mike? Moral support, because their non-Jews are not commanded to keep Shemitah, but you're not allowed to give them an actual hand. The umoter lirdos iman hakores, v'chochrin mehem nirin she'enu b'nei chiyuv k'dei liknos osa. But you can take out a honeycomb from a beehive, and you can also make a nirin. I think is if you have a field that's already a planting and plowed, and so it's growing, that's a near. So our translator here says you could enter a sharecropping agreement with them. They're not obligated in Shemitah that we would fine them or punish them punish them with the punishment of not allowing them to use that property. So Radva says on this halacha that this is talking about if it's a beehive of a non-Jew. So it happens to be, there is a machlokus in the Gemara. It talks about taking out a beehive on Shabbos. So there's a machlokus if that's a malacha of like harvesting. It's not, we know it's not harvesting, but it's considered karka. The beehive is considered connected to the ground. So if by taking out this honey comb or whatever they call it, this chunk of honey, you're detaching something that's connected to the ground. There's a machlokas, I think, Tanaim, if it's considered harvesting or not. But we know for Shemitah, I mean, a honey doesn't grow from the ground. So in regard to Shabbos, the problem is separating things that you have that the av malacha is to harvest something, but the tolda, the derived prohibition would include separating things from the ground, even if it's not literally planted. For example, well, I don't know if this might be more similar than our case, but if you have a flower pot that has a hole in the bottom of it, that's considered connected to the ground. So if you pick it up, it's considered that you're harvesting something, even though it's not literally connected to the ground. But the hole in the bottom of the flower pot that's on the ground makes it that the flower pot is connected to the ground. I think we spoke about this a little bit in regard to hydroponics or growing stuff in greenhouses. If you put metal or whatever shelving underneath, so it's not actually in the ground. To just say, so the Radbaz says you're allowed to help if the beehive is owned by a non-Jew, but you're not allowed to do that for a Jewish beehive, a Jewishly owned beehive. So I don't know if this means that because of just like in malachos of Shemitah, there's also avos and toldos, so you're not allowed to use honey on Shemitah either if it's from Eretz Yisrael, connected from the ground. Yeah, what's the question? It's a question. It's actually a question. If you might make shahakal on it. Yeah, it's a bit of a shaila. So I had a slightly different shaila, and my shaila was for yashan. That the stuff that grows, you're not allowed to eat it until after the second day of Pesach. So what happens if you would grow it? Also, would you grow it hydroponics? So I think even Nosei Kalim on the Shulchan Aruch, the commentators inside of Shulchan Aruch say according to some of them, you'd only make mizonos on such bread. My question was, would the laws of Shemitah apply if it doesn't come from the ground or not? And then there is a tshuva written, I think, shortly before the Holocaust. I found later that someone did, discuss this issue, but they mentioned that you're not supposed to make hamotzi on bread like that. So if it's a tomato, it's not clear that it would be Adama. The big nafkamina would then be in Gush Katif when they grew the lettuce in water. That wouldn't have been Hadama lettuce either. It would have been Shahakal, according to that opinion. I don't know how we pass it, but there is some. I don't know what the conclusion is, Allah, but I don't know poskim who say something like that. If we know it's hydroponic, yeah. And it appears from the Kesef Mishnah on this halacha that it doesn't matter. You're allowed to also take the honey out of a Jew's beehive, even though it's connected to the ground, because taking out of a beehive is not considered avodas karka. Avodas karka means it's work on the ground, even though it's connected. And who's this? He brings, I don't know what sefer this is. Kuf Hey is his abbreviation. Kuf Hey Taf Hilchos Yisrael. That nowadays at Shmita is only made Rabbanan, you could do that Jews are allowed to do malachos on the work on the karka if it's land that's owned by a non-Jew. And certainly you'd be allowed to help a Jew, a non-Jew actively. It's his land. I could help him. He says, could you hold, can you he's holding this, so can you quick dig a hole for me to put this in? You could dig the hole for him or something like that. According to this, there'd even be a little bit of a leniency to have a Jew work the land nowadays, according to that we sell the land to the non-Jew as a sale, even though we're not allowed to sell a non-Jew land in Eretz Yisrael, but it's impossible to sell it to a Jew. And if by not selling it, it's going to be a big loss to Jews, we could say that it might be mutter to sell it to a goy. So this we spoke about on Shemitah, the Heter Mechira. I mean, on Shavuos, we spoke about it. And since we can't permit the work, and for the produce to be, since we're not allowed to do work or use the fruit to remove this Kedusha Shemitah unless we sell it to a goy, and since there's going to be a tremendous loss, and we're not going to be able to keep all the laws of Shemitah for many people that live in Eretz Yisrael, therefore, some say that you are a lechatchila, meaning ab initio, allowed to sell it to a goy in order to get around the sanctity of Shemitah. And then once it's owned by a non-Jew, then a Jew could do the work on the land because the land doesn't have sanctity when the foreman and the guy in charge is a non-Jew. So a non-Jew owns it, and the non-Jew is the boss, the foreman. And we could rely on this in a very pressing need nowadays, that we can combine this heter along with the heter. We're not really sure if it's really Shemitah. So it's interesting. We don't know for sure that this year now is the first year of the Shemitah cycle, because right now we're in the first year of Shemitah cycle. The Luach, the Ezra Torah Luach says it's treated like the first year according to the minhag of Eretz Yisrael, and the Rambam says that the minhag is that this year, this is such and such as the cycle, but we're not 100% sure about it. So sometimes we can add a doubt. Maybe this year really isn't Shemitah. However, so even though we will let Jews do avodas karka, still the main actual things we would only have a non-Jew do. So to plow and to harvest and to prune and to harvest from the grapes, that we'd only have a non-Jew do. And similarly, plowing, we said, is a machlokas. There's different opinions about it. So if it's possible to get a goy to also do the plowing, we could do that, because we saw it's a machlokas if plowing is considered one of the prohibited acts or not. It's machlokas Yishona. And it appears from the Yerushalmi, according that in the time when Jews take tax from Israel, or the Jews who work the land, even if they're working the land in a prohibited fashion, because the Tosfos already mentions that in the time of the taxes, we're allowed to work the Shemitah. It's a machlokas which acts we're allowed to do on Shemitah, but we're allowed to do that because if we don't do that, the Goyim are going to make it much worse for us if we don't pay the tax. So what happens if they work to make more than what the tax is? However, we could say, you could say, good job because of Darkei Shalom. Because even though he's doing it prohibited, it's kind of like he's forced, because they're forced to do it from the fact that we have to raise the money to pay the king. But again, our economy has changed from that type of situation. And there is an opinion, Hilchos Yisrael, that when there's a tax on the land itself, you're allowed to do all the work in the land, and the heter is not limited to only pay the tax. So I mean, part of the reason is if we have to pay a tax, it shows that we're not the owners. According to this opinion, you can actually help the people who are working, and the Gra is brought down in the Beis Yisrael of the Pas HaShulchan that you're allowed to, let's say you're a repairman, can you, repair the tools that he's going to use to plow or to harvest or things like that, or to thresh. Actually, he's actually saying about the threshing, but he says you're allowed to fix, to sharpen the tool, fix the tool, but you're not allowed to actually do it with him. Halacha test. You're allowed in Syria, which is seems to be part of northern Israel that David HaMelech conquered, but he didn't have full authorization to engage in that military campaign to do it. So it's not considered full-blown Eretz Yisrael. So for certain things, it's like Eretz Yisrael, and for certain things, it's not. So in Syria, you're allowed to do work. So Shmita doesn't apply in Midiraisa, but Chachamim say you have to do many parts of Shmita. So you're allowed to do work on unattached stuff, but you're not allowed to do malacha on the ground itself. So dashim v'zarin v'dorchin uma'amrin. You can thresh and winnow and squeeze grapes and make piles of the grain once it's already cut. You're not allowed to harvest or crops or grapes or olives or things like that. So the Beis Yisrael in the Pas HaShulchan brings down a Ram, I'm not sure who that is, that you're allowed to, that this means that in Syria you could do, once it's talish, once it's disconnected from the ground, you could do any malacha. Even if this was planted illegally or unlawfully, once it's off the ground, you can do all these malachos with it. Even though in Eretz Yisrael you couldn't do it at all. But Rabbeinu Tam, or also the opinion of the Rashi's Rabbi Yevamos Kook Beis, and the Gra says that if you knew that this field was, the owner in Syria lacked the field, so if he didn't treat it as hefker, then you're not allowed to do any work, even though right now it's harvested. So the fact that which is mutter in Syria is only if you knew that it was grown properly. That if Eretz Yisrael, that's the difference between Eretz Yisrael and Syria. Eretz Yisrael, you even in that case, if it was kept ownerless, you couldn't do this malacha, but in Syria you can. So according to the opinions, that it seems to be a machlokas of poskim. Most contemporary poskim seem to hold that you have to keep Shemitah in Eilat. I looked into this a few months ago, and I was a little bit surprised since Eilat might be more. Maybe I'm mixing it up with Gush Katif, which doesn't apply anymore because there aren't Jews right now in Gush Katif, unfortunately. But because Eilat is mentioned in the Torah as a boundary of Eretz Yisrael, and it's probably the same Eilat. But remember, the other halacha is, besides for it had to be conquered by Yeshua, then people had to move there after Babel, in the time of Ezra, to move there. So did they actually move back or not to Eilat? I'm not sure. But is Eilat the same din as Syria? I would say not. Eilat is more Eretz Yisrael than Surya in general, I think. I mean, Eilat is not exactly farmland. It's the desert. It's 120 degrees there in the summer. It's there's water there, but it doesn't water. It's because in Israel they have the weather for some big cities, and Beersheba also is in the desert. Yud kishem she'asur lasos charbah pe'eshviyas or l'shamron kach asur likach me'am haaretz. Just like you're not allowed to buy and sell Shemitah produce or to guard them because you have to keep them ownerless. You're also not allowed to buy them from an ignoramus. The fish ain't most from Dmei Shviyas Lamaris because we're not allowed to give Shemitah money to such a person. Filo kolshu, not even one coin. Shema lo yochalos because we can't rely that he is gonna keep the laws of Shemitah with the money. Because remember, the money you can only buy human food with, and then you have to treat that food with kedusha shviyas. We don't trust that they're going to do this. Okay, halacha yud aleph. Halokech lulav me'amart b'shviyas notzon le'esrog matana. If you buy lokeach if you buy a lulav from an art and shmita, he should give you the esrog as a gift. Bim lo nasan lo mabliot me esrog b'dmei lulav. You should have to swallow up the price of the esrog with the lulav. Meaning a lulav is just a branch. There's no fruit from that. So that doesn't really have kedusha shviyas. And esrog does have kedusha shviyas. So you could pay, it's like in the old days, Larry is old enough to hear these stories. I'm not. I mean, I've only heard the stories, but that when people were getting tickets from Chicago policemen, someone said, "Oh, your pencil is such a nice pen. Can I pay you $20 for your pen?" Hoping that they won't give. I'm not saying you did it, Larry. That's not all. I said just hearing the stories of it happening to people. That's all I'm saying. Someone told me a story that that's happening, and the guy said, "Oh, that's such a nice pen. Can I buy your pen for $20?" So he said, "Yeah, here." And then he wrote him on a ticket with another pen. There was recently a comedy group in Israel. They made up a thing that if you're in trouble, give tzedakah to this thing. So the guy got pulled over for speeding or whatever, and the guy said, "I'm going to give you a 300 shekel fine," but he didn't know that his son in the car pledged 400 shekel to this tzedakah if they didn't get a ticket. So he was all happy that he didn't get a ticket, but then he had to pay more for the tzedakah. So then he starts fighting with, "Make my ticket higher." It was a comedy routine. It was pretty funny. Yeah. So I'm saying, so instead of paying now back in the day, it was just a couple dollars for a lulav for the last 15 years because of some real wise guys who thought they could get a monopoly. Now we have to pay $15 or $20 for a lulav. But basically, you have to pay. You're paying a lot of money for the lulav, and you get the esrog for free. So it's not considered that there's any buying or selling of the esrog, which is a lulav, which is of the esrog, which is shemitah produce. So Rav Kook mentions Tosos and Sukkah says that in general you're not allowed to sell perishvias through havla either. So let's say you're selling him wine, and he's saying, "Oh, I'm buying a $20 jug from you, and there's going to be some wine in the jug." That doesn't work. Oh, he says no. He says that does work, rather. And similarly, it says that if you make a condition that the money is for your labor, and moving it from your place to my place, that's what I'm paying you for. And then, automatically you get to keep the wine. That's also a permitted way of getting around the prohibition of engaging in buying and selling of Shemitah produce. So we see that in this case, you're not actually doing the perishvias, and there's no Shemitah money. You don't have to worry about the money getting kedusha shvias. I just want to point out that the opinions with Rav Kook was not. I mean, they say that he used it in connection with the Heter Mechira, but according to the people from the Chazon Ish, based on the Chazon Ish about who used the oats or based in, they say the cost of the stuff is for the labor and stuff, not for the produce itself. Good base. But Madamar more bisman shumach appears shekamoson b'shimor to go into inavri monoch yotzbehem. So this is talking about when you have to do something like this. That's because you're selling something that's usually guarded. So it's usually something that you wouldn't be allowed to sell on Shemitah, like a pomegranate or a fig. Avalim haya mocher pir shechaskasim in a hefker, kagon a pegam a year buzin hashotim hachagalos kisbor shel harmach yotzmeh harei zemotu likach mimenu ma'at kidmei shel shvus zvad b'shum kidei chayav shel mocher. But if it's something that if you're buying something which is usually grown from it's from like something wild that it's not wild, meaning it's not fenced in. He says, where am I? Rue, amaranth, moss, rose, coriander, and the like. You're allowed to buy a small amount, which is about 3 meals worth, in order that the seller can make a little bit of a living. Rav Kook says if you gave him, but what happens if he gives you a big chunk, which is more than 3 meals worth of food? You have to say, he has to say, this money that I'm giving to this person. So meaning, when you buy 3 meals worth of food, in this case, we say that the money doesn't transfer. But if you're buying more, then the sanctity doesn't transfer. But when you're buying more, the sanctity is going to transfer to the money. So you have to say, the sanctity that would go on this money, because I'm buying it from this guy, it's going to go on other non-Shemitah produce that I have in my house that are not Shemitah produce. So therefore, you're not giving money to someone who's not going to treat it with the proper sanctity, and then it's okay. Okay, he says something, I don't understand it, but in certain cases, we make you try to get the money back from that guy, I guess, change it for other money, so that the Kedusha, the holy money, the money that has the sanctity of Shvius, you'll have, and it'll treat it properly. I don't understand how he makes that jump. Yud Gimel. If something that you don't have to take tithes off of, it's super strong garlic. It's called shum bali bechi, means garlic that makes you cry because it's so strong. Ubatzel shel richba and richba onions, v'grisen hakal kalios, and a certain type of bean, v'adashim hamitrios, and Egyptian lentils, v'chein zarone gina she'inu nechalos, or things that grow in the garden, these seedy type things that are not really edible, kagon zeralefes v'tzanon harafeot behem, like these seeds of turnips and radishes. You're allowed to buy them on Shemitah because they're not really usually human food. And Rav Kook says you're allowed to, which means that you're allowed to give even to an Haaretz 3 meals worth, just like any produce that the assumption is that they come from ownerless. Yodala, this is only if it's just a general ignoramus. Well, someone who is suspect of actually engaging in commerce with Shemitah produce, so lishmar peros of limkomram, where we know that he puts a fence around, he locks his field and doesn't let people in, and then he sells it. We can't buy anything if it's at all possible that it's Shemitah produce. We're not allowed to buy from him even flax, even if it's combed out already. But you can buy flax that has already been twisted and ready to use, because that takes a while, so it's probably not from this year. And flax, says Rav Kook, there is an assumption that there's Shemitah for it, even though we don't have to worry about Shemitah in the flax itself, like we learned in Halacha Zayin, because it's just wood. It's not a fruit or a vegetable or a seed from it. However, since we have to apply Shemitah in the seed of the flax, therefore it makes it important enough that it has a connection to Shemitah, so you have to be careful, the reason is different. I was wrong. I said if it was twisted, it's changed so much it doesn't look like the Shemitah produce anymore. I said that because it's twisted, we assume it's from a earlier year because it was processed. But no, the reason is it doesn't look like it's now turned into something else. It was a raw material, or even if it was combed out, we were assuming it's still close enough to the thing. But when it was spun into threads, now it's considered something completely different. And it appears from the Rash in Maasros, the 5th chapter, that these things you're allowed to buy from anyone because the chazaka, the assumption is that it came from an ownerless place. And you're allowed to also give these, from these species, 3 meals to an Haaretz so that he could live. You're allowed to even buy it from someone who's known to engage in buying and selling Shemitah produce because we assume this is okay. So then why do we say you're not allowed to buy something from someone who's suspected? What's the difference between a person who's just ignorant versus someone who we know is a known offender of Shemitah laws? How come you can't buy something from him if there's any connection to Shemitah from it? That's because something that you usually buy a lot of, Chachamim punished you and said you're not allowed to buy from that guy. They said they punished him that you're only allowed to buy 3 meals worth and nothing else. And karkom, which I think is, some transfer as coriander and some translate karkom as saffron, I think. I've seen it translated a bunch of different ways. That is also prohibited because of svichen. We're worried that people planted it and claim, oh, it sprouted up by itself. He says that karkom is saffron. Okay. I've also seen Art Scroll translate that same word, the word karkom, different ways in different places. It's even in the sitter in Korbanos in the morning. Let's try to finish this. So there are people we assume they don't take off Meiser, which is only rabbinic, but they take off the Truma. And there are people that we suspect, or we have more than just suspect, but reason to believe they don't keep the laws of Shemitah. But just because they don't take Meiser doesn't mean we have to assume that they don't keep Shemitah. And also, just because we know someone deals in Shemitah produce doesn't mean we can't trust them about Meiser. Even though Meiser is a Torah law and Shemitah is a Torah law, Meiser Tanavas Malka Masha Enkim B'Shvias. Meiser has a different level of Torah. You have to bring Meiser Sheni to Yerushalayim, and we don't assume that they're willing to spend a few pennies or even a few dimes to not violate the Torah law. But then for them to with their bodies to actually have to inconvenience themselves, that they're not willing to do. And the reason why we're worried that they might not engage in Meiser is because they wouldn't take the Meiser Sheni to Yerushalayim. But the Shemitah stuff, they don't have to literally physically move anywhere. They'll keep those laws. And in the opposite way, in regard to Shemitah, Shemitah you can't redeem. But Meiser Sheni can be redeemed. So there's different reasons why they may not engage in one, but that reason may not apply to the other one. So you don't have to assume bad of them for both of them unless you know that they are. If someone we know doesn't keep the food pure, clean, they don't keep it isolated from coming tameh, we don't worry about that they don't take Meiser or Shemitah. Because if they bought something from the street, so you can't assume that was tahor, that's not gonna, and then let's say Truma touches it, that only makes makes tame. I would say the word contaminate, but we're talking about tuma. It only makes something, it contaminates it with the tuma on a rabbinic tuma. But midiraisa, the food can't make a different food tame. Just because he doesn't keep that law of the sofrim doesn't mean he's meticulous on the Torah, things like that. But Rav Kook says we're not allowed to sell Shemitah produce to someone who is a suspect on not keeping the Shemitah laws except for 3 meals worth. This is only for something that's going to last. If it doesn't last, you are allowed to sell it for 100 meals worth of stuff, because the whole prohibition to sell him Shemitah produce is because maybe he's going to engage in merchandising with it, or he's not going to get rid of it in the proper way, the beer time. But since this is very perishable, you're selling him something very perishable, it doesn't last, he's going to buy it to use it now. And also because it's perishable, we know it's not going to last till the beer time, so there's no problem. Someone who himself, we know he doesn't keep, or he has a reputation that he doesn't keep this halacha, and so we don't trust that he does it. He does have trustworthy to say, I don't keep this halacha, but Shmerel 3 stalls down in the shuk, he is meticulous on that. So even though we don't trust him himself, but we accept his what he says about someone else. And the Ravid says that someone who is suspect, we don't trust him. And just like he's not trusted for himself, he's not trusted on something else. And the Beis Yisrael, the Pasach Shulchan and Hilchos Damai, makes a distinction between if he's talking about this particular food. But this is, I'm selling trade, but he has real kosher food over there, or if it's something else. Is it something that's not kosher at all, or is it something else? So even though we know that he's not reliable on this, but why should he lie if he's not going to get anything out of it? Because if he's saying go to Shmerel's stall, why should he lie? He's not getting any money out of it. As long as we know that he's not going to get a kickback. If they have a reputation, he says gomlin. So the idea is a kickback. I don't know what the actual Hebrew word. He says gomlin bedavar, but gomlin is a given. He's gonna, the idea is if we know that the guy's gonna give him a kickback for steering the business there, then it is a problem. But when he's just saying that this, but if he's testifying that, meaning it's a difference. He's saying that if you say that Shmerel's food is kosher, that's okay. But if you say Shmerel's a reliable guy, you can trust him, whatever. That we don't trust him. We can trust him about Shmerel's food, but not about Shmerel himself. Because it's not because we don't trust him about Shmerel, but since we know that he's engaging in this stuff, he's not a kosher witness. And someone in your Adea, someone Kufiyot Test, makes a distinction. What's this? A small commentary on the side of the Shulchan Aruch Yerdea says that he says, I don't know if this is kosher or not, but he says stam that they're general, then we worried maybe he's not reliable. But if he says that he saw that it was properly shachted or whatever, nowadays this isn't so relevant. But if he says I saw that it actually became kosher, and then you could rely on him for what he says about someone else. You can't trust just stam a kohen about Shemitah, because they can make the following claim. Since truma is mutter and Shemitah there's no truma, for non-Jews they're not allowed to eat. I mean, non-Kohanim are not allowed to eat truma, but I'm allowed to eat truma. So in Shemitah there is no death penalty at all, for a non-Kohen who eats truma, there's a death penalty. So these are definitely okay. What's the worst that can happen to me? Nothing. So that was an argument they would make, and therefore some Kohanim are lax. Lefikach sa truma shnaf lamea sa shel perish shvius hala. So if you have a sa of truma that fell to 100 sa of Shemitah produce, it's nullified, because the law of truma isn't 1 in 60, it's 1 in 100. But naflo lepachos memeir yirkuva akol. But if it fell into less than 100, you have to let the whole thing waste. Normally, if truma falls into something else, and it's in less than 1 in 100, so it's like 1 in 80, so you have to sell to a Kohen. So the way the market works, for whatever reason, even though Kohanim is a smaller market, but I guess there's a decent amount of truma available, the price of truma stuff is cheap. So if you can't use it, you sell it to a Kohen in general. But here, even though we don't want to lose Shemitah produce, we're not allowed to sell it to the Kohanim, because we don't believe them that they're gonna treat it at the proper sanctity. People who dye cloths and stuff, he translates here as painters, and patamim he says is cattle raisers. They're allowed to buy bran from anywhere. So bran, I guess, is an ingredient they need. I guess they feed the animals bran, and the painters need it, I guess, to make their paint or whatever. They can buy bran from whatever. And Choshen Shema Misviche Shvius, so we're not worried that it was from Svichem, the stuff that grew by itself that the Chachamim banned. So people don't say, oh, it grew by itself, but really they planted it. And Rav Kook says this is only if we don't know if they're reliable or not. We don't know one way or the other, then you could buy from him. But if you know that someone is not reliable for Shemitah stuff, you're not allowed to buy the brand from such a person. Last halacha in this chapter, what if you're the kupa? So the kupa is the tzedakah that they would collect a plate. They would go around every day and say, what did you cook today? You have to put some in this container. And it was ready-made food, meaning there was the tamchoy and the kupa. Actually, no, the kupa is collecting the money, the weekly money. So the gabai, the collector of the kupa and Shemitah, doesn't have to worry, or he shouldn't be exact against entering the courtyards of people who, meaning, they think that Shmerel sells Shemitah produce, or buys or sells Shemitah produce. So if he gives us money, coins for tzedakah, these coins might have Kedusha Shvius on it. So should they refrain from taking the coins? So the Rambam says, no, they didn't refrain from taking those coins. And if they gave them bread, you're allowed to use the bread. We don't worry that maybe it was from Svichem. We're not worried that Jews are going to give towards the tzedakah stuff that was improperly Shemitah produce. You're allowed to borrow Shemitah produce from the poor people, and you should pay them back with produce from the next year that isn't Shemitah produce. The Yerushalmi says in Demai that the fact that a Gabbai Tzedakah is allowed to take money and stuff from people who we think engage in Shemitah stuff, that's only when they plant it, but they don't eat it. But if we know that they plant it and they sell to non-Jews, but we think that they also use it themselves, they don't just sell it all to non-Jews, then you're not allowed to take it from them. And the Radva says in this halacha that this is only if they're suspected about not keeping Shemitah, when it's not for sure. But if you know for sure that they use improper Shemitah produce, then you're not allowed to take their money for the tzedakah. And that which you're allowed to lend, to borrow fruit from non-Jews on Shemitah, and then to return them fruit from the next year, we don't say, because the swap, the barter, it doesn't make the Shemitah sanctity go on the other year's crop. That's when the Shemitah produce has been consumed before you return the loan. But if you still have those Shemitah produce and you pay them back with barter with the different produce, then the Kedusha swaps to the new produce, and then that's a problem. They have to treat that as Shemitah produce. And if the Shemitah produce is no longer extant, then you could even pay them back on Shemitah with 6-year produce, meaning again, not Shemitah produce. And then the Kedusha isn't going to swap from one type of fruit to another fruit. And it appears that you're not allowed to return Shemitah produce if the original fruits are no longer example, because you're not allowed to pay back an obligation from Shemitah produce. But if you didn't finish them, then it's just like exchanging. You're swapping with each other, and then you're allowed to, because you're not paying back a debt with Shemitah produce. We never find that you're prohibited from trading Shemitah produce unless you're either you can't trade it as if it's, meaning you can't use it as barter, because you're paying. It looks at it's instead of using money, you're bartering, but you're doing it in a way where you lend something and you pay something back. So we are lenient on that. So that's the end of chapter 8. We already did chapter 9, and then that's all we have from Rav Kook, because the next few chapters in the Rambam talk about the fields returning and the slaves going free, which had to do with Yovel and stuff like that. So Rav Kook didn't write a commentary on that. And then the last Perek we mentioned talks a little bit more about the Levium, and then about learning Torah. And there's some relevance to the permissibility or lack of permissibility to learn in Kollel and not engage in making a living. So I think that we have come to an end of this for this cycle. So Hadron Alach, we will return to these halachos, hopefully next time on a D'Oraisa level without a suffix, and we'll be in Eretz Yisrael, and we'll rechazer them and then know how to do it Lamaisa. But it's a good start now. Yeshua Koach.